Symbols are a divine language that we have forgotten. Humanity is essentially symbol illiterate. How do we regain literacy in the divine language of symbology? Well, first we need to understand really what symbols are, right? So when we look at a symbol and we try to understand it, we need to understand that symbols come from the divine realm. It's a way of understanding the divine realm. They come naturally to a sage, a seer, an artist, and so forth and so on. This natural idea or intuition that we have, which is like this divine spark that comes to us. And those symbols and let's say text as well represent certain aspects of the divine. Now, this language is coming from the subconscious and the unconscious, right? These symbols come from the depth of our being and they represent certain aspects of the divine, like I just said. And so that is what this type of language is, right? This symbology or this symbolic language that we find with the symbols in particularly the spiritual traditions is a language and something you can understand if your consciousness is attuned to that divine realm. But we have completely forgotten about this because we live in a materialist world. And as a result of living in a materialist world, even people who believe they are religious are driven by materialism and at its core, a sense of atheism and a lack of faith and trust. And so then there's a lack of understanding what these symbols are. And actually, when we look at it from the scientific perspective, science is not too favorable of these type of symbols because they are in the field of proof and facts and don't like anything essentially from the intuitive realm and don't like many things related to the divine because they are stuck in the field of logic. And so when you present a metaphysical language to them, they are completely indifferent to it because they are in, as I said, the field of logic, and so they need proof and or facts, even though you can neither prove nor deny the existence of this divine realm, right? And so that's a big problem and obstacle that the scientific field have. And so when they are presented with these symbols, these divine symbols, they are completely indifferent to them and actually don't accept them, even though there is this subtle language and even there's geometry within these symbols and so forth and so on that sometimes defies logic for people in the modern day, but it exists nevertheless. And so as I said, humanity is basically symbol illiterate. So when we see certain symbols, we don't know what they are, we don't know how to understand them, but our ancient ancestors understood them, right? They didn't need to read an entire text or they didn't need to read an academic paper about certain things. You could show them one symbol and they knew what it represents and what its meaning is and the metaphysical language behind it. But we are completely disconnected with this divine language, and so we are symbol illiterate, and we need to get back our literacy in this divine language. And this is a big reason why we misinterpret certain symbols as well, and we culturally appropriate certain symbols. One such example is the obvious swastika. That is a sacred symbol within Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. And unfortunately, many people believe that is related to World War II and Nazi Germany, but that is not what the swastika is. What the Nazis had used was actually what is called a Hakenkreuz, which actually means hooked cross. And unfortunately, many people since World War II have looked at the symbols of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism in the sense of fascism, right? They actually think that Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism have some sort of relationship to fascism because they use this ancient symbol, mind you, of the swastika. It hasn't been around since the 40s, an ancient symbol. And so people misinterpret and culturally appropriate that and think that that's what Hitler was using, for example, right? The Nazi party were using. But that is a complete misunderstanding and a cultural appropriation. And nevertheless, it was the Hakenkreuz, the hooked cross, right? And so this is how people can be confused about symbols because they don't have symbol literacy. They are completely illiterate. And so people misinterpret certain symbols, right? And sometimes you can tell people this to the end of days, but they still don't believe you. Woke people in the West, for example, with their insane ideology, often think Hindus are fascist and right-wingers and, all of these labels that are supposed to make you a bad person, even though they might want to turn the gaze within on themselves. And there's a famous story about that at Harvard University involving a young Indian lady who was completely condemned for wearing the swastika. And those people had a lack of understanding about that it is the Hakenkreuz that the Germans were using and not the swastika. You got to remember, the swastika is perpendicular where the Hakenkreuz is distorted, if you want to say that it is the swastika, right? And there are certain aspects of the swastika that are completely different anyway from the Nazi version of it, in air quotes, right? And so that's how we can have a misinterpretation. Look, when we talk about insane logic like that we find in the West, it's better to just go in the other direction and realize that they are a minority and have a lot of hate in their hearts. And it's unfortunate because Hinduism in general has been undermined in the West with these certain minority groups that spread such divisive ideology, and it's just through a lack of understanding. And so when we understand the symbol at its core, then you know what it's truly trying to convey, right? And so when we look at the swastika of the Hindu, the Buddhists, and the Jains, it's much more to do with prosperity and wisdom rather than anything to do with World War II. And there is a bit of controversy around that the Christian evangelicals actually interpreted the symbol that way to kind of undermine the Hindus. But that's another side topic, right? But that is just an example of how we become symbol illiterate. And so we need to become symbol literate and understand the divine language and get out of our activist mentality that maybe your school and your society and people in your community have trained you to be, because that will block you from understanding this language, and it actually will block you from the divine. There is no doubt about that. And so a good example of symbology and how we are symbolic illiterate is the way we look at the devatas in Hinduism, right? The way we look at the devatas in Hinduism, we think they're sometimes actual literal beings, and people who are not familiar with scriptures of Sanatana Dharma don't understand the energy that the devatas represent, right? And so the devatas essentially have no form, even though we've given them a form, right? This is the importance of symbology. We've given them a form to depict the energy that they represent, right? And so it's an unconscious image that has come to the artist or the saint or the seer, and they've put it down on paper or in a sculpture to represent that energy that the devata exhibits. And so this is something we don't think about, right? The energy of the devata. Some people think that there's actually a real Hanuman walking around. There's a real Shiva walking around, but they represent certain types of energy and relate to the aptitude of people in society. And so to speak to that, right? Like if we look at the two main Ishta devatas in India, you have Vishnu and you have Shiva, right? And so the energy of Vishnu, for example, is much more cultural and much more bhakti devotionally oriented, right? And so that's why when we think of Vishnu, we have like a lot of dance, there's a lot of art, and there's a lot of community orientation, right? And it's just much more cultural in general. It's much more communal. And that's sort of the essence of Vishnu, is this communal cultural aspect where we celebrate the gods through bhakti. We celebrate through devotion, right? We celebrate through dance, art, and so forth. Where then when we look at Shiva, the energy of Shiva is the same energy that the yogis and the sadhus embody. And so that's the energy of renunciation, of asceticism, right? That's what the energy of Shiva is. It's the energy of the one who is meditative, the one who is oriented towards renunciation, who wants to go into the Himalayas, who wants to go into a cave and meditate for a long period of time in sadhana, and are dedicated to the ultimate reality of Shiva, right? This is the energy of Shiva, as opposed to the energy of Vishnu. So it's not that there isn't a culture built around Shiva, don't get me wrong, but the energy and essence of Shiva is much more about renunciation and jnana yoga, right? The knowledge of Brahman, the ultimate reality. Shiva is a representation of the Brahman, right? Vishnu is also a representation of the Brahman in a different aspect, in the cultural aspect. But Shiva here is a representation of Brahman as the ascetic, as the renunciate who has renounced the world to merge as one with Brahman. And so that's what jnana yoga is, right? That's the knowledge of Brahman. So you aspire to have Atma Bodha, right? So self-knowledge, and self here is Atman. So the knowledge that Atman is Brahman. This is what you're aspiring for. And so even in relation to that, right? Shiva as the renunciate, as the recluse, Shiva's energy is also the deconstructive energy, right? Some people call him the destroyer, the destruction element of the universe, which actually means to destroy the jiva, the ego persona system. And so Shiva is that energy we embody when we are on the spiritual path, when we are dissolving the identity so we can merge back as one with the ultimate reality. And so Shiva is that deconstructive element, that deconstructive fire, so to speak, which burns everything away and only leaves ashes, right? Hence the yogis and the sadhus wipe ashes all over themselves, which is a symbol to represent that they have renounced the world. They are basically dead as an individual identity, right? They have merged with Shiva. So the ashes itself is a symbol, right? And we still don't see that. We just see these people walking around. Some people think are crazy people with ashes all over them. We think, what the hell are they doing? But if you understand the symbology of these traditions, then you can see reality at a deeper level. And so getting back to the energy of the Devata, as I said, you will resonate with one Devata over the other according to your aptitude, right? According to your nature. What we would call the gunas, your quality in Sanatana Dharma. So, for example, if you were meditative, you'd probably gravitate more towards Shiva. And if you were maybe highly intelligent, you'll gravitate more towards Ganesha, because Ganesha's energy is related a lot to heightened intelligence, divine intelligence, if you will. And so you build an intimate relationship with these devatas as a result. And so the devata, as I said, is essentially formless, but we have a symbol for it to represent the energy of that aspect of the universe. And so again, this is the language, right? This is the symbolic language that we find within the universe only for those with the eyes to see. Most of us can't see this language. And so when we see the images of all these gods and all of these divine images and symbols, we don't know what they're trying to convey. But once you have cleansed your vision, you will be able to see a divine language right before your eyes. So just like the Devata, you also are a symbol. This physical being, your psychological makeup, this is a symbol and an expression of the divine. And not just us. Trees, animals, this microphone, everything is a symbol of the divine, especially when it has naturally arose, right? Not by the human mind, but it has just naturally arose. Like if we look at a tree, if we look at the human being, if we look at a cow, if we look at the grass, if we look at the clouds, right? These are all an expression of the divine. And it goes to an even deeper level, right? Because a lot of things in reality are geometrically sound in nature. And we can also see this when we look at the Fibonacci sequence, right? From Italian mathematician Leonardo Fibonacci, we see that a lot of things in nature are in line with the golden ratio that we find from the Fibonacci sequence. So we find that golden ratio in many things. I mean, we can measure things like with our knuckles, our nose, and everything like this, and you can find the golden ratio almost in everything. You don't have to even mention a sunflower, right? You see this kind of spiral formation, this sequence that's within reality. And so it's ever present, it is there, but a lot of people are not cognizant of it. And so that's even a deeper layer, right? And this also relates to Li in Chinese, which is a Taoist principle, which is translated as organic pattern, and the Chinese cleverly translated it as the markings in jade, the grain of wood, and the fiber and muscle. So it's this organic pattern that is inherently there in reality as a divine signature in the world, right? It's divinity impressing its own symbol into nature. And that's why we find the golden ratio and the Fibonacci sequence within a lot of things within nature, because it's inherently there. It's not a coincidence. We are a symbol of the divine, but we don't understand that because we feel like we're an isolated individual trying to navigate this chaotic world. So when you realize that we have that Li organic pattern within us, we are an expression of the divine, we begin to reflect the energy of the Devata, right? You become a reflection of the Devata naturally. It's not something that you cultivate. It's what you gravitated towards, what you found affinity with is what you begin to naturally express. So you become a pure reflection of the divine. We naturally are a reflection of the divine in the sense that we are naturally constituted to nature, right? But on a psychological and spiritual level, we even reflect the nature of the deity that we resonate with. And so that's basically it when we talk about symbol illiteracy. So when we realize that we are an expression of the divine, we are a symbol of the divine, when we start to gain an understanding of the symbols around us, we start to see this language, and we see there's a lot more going on in reality than we think. And once we do that, then we start to gain this symbol literacy, right? The symbol literacy, where we can understand the divine realm. We can begin to understand the deeper nature of reality, not just of ourselves, but of reality itself, and how there is a undeniable unity of all life. Actually, there's not two, there's not three, it's one without a second. It's actually a pure sense of oneness without a second. And you begin to understand this when you begin to have literacy and a divine language of symbology. Shanti, shanti, shanti.